D'Aubuisson. The case of Roberto D'Aubuisson was far more complex, but boiled down to the same thing. Never mind morality. A foreign contact is useful when and if he matches up with U.S. policy objectives. D'Aubuisson had been a hardline major in the Salvadoran army, so radically anti-communist, so extreme in his hatred of anyone even suspected of being on the left, and so open about it that he was expelled from the Corps for the sake of appearance. But inside or outside the institution of the Salvadoran Armed Forces, D'Aubuisson was a military force to be reckoned with, and he was always close to the United States. Although for public consumption, D'Aubuisson was condemned and shunned by the U.S., privately he was embraced and never condemned by any key policymaker. He came to Panama several times, and we would have long talks, which were unavoidably and inevitably political. He was a tough, wiry, energetic man, anti-communist to the bone, and oppressively military in manner. He walked and stood ramrod straight, even in informal situations. He was always stiff and starched, his pursed, tight lips ready to launch into a tirade. It was evident that his principal reason for coming to Panama was not to meet with me, but to hold strategy sessions at the Southern Command. Panamanian intelligence was able to monitor what was going on at such events, even though we weren't invited in. There would be planning meetings with U.S. and Salvadoran officers, and sometimes Argentina would send up a military group to analyze the situation. In such settings, D'Aubuisson was frequently the protagonist. He would present his analysis of tactics and how things were going in the war, and he was given intelligence briefings by U.S. officials in return. On one visit to my house, he brought whiskey and became increasingly loud and argumentative as the night wore on. "Look, Manuel Antonio," he said, "you have the communists from El Salvador wandering around Panama all the time. I don't understand how you people can give protection to these communists." "And how do you know anything about it?" I asked. "I have my own sources of information here, who tell me that the guerrilla commanders are always coming and going whenever they want." "Come on," I told him. "We're actually helping San Salvador by letting them come in," I said, making a joke. "At least when they're in Panama, they're not causing you any trouble. They're probably here partying. Life is different in Panama." D'Aubuisson would not be deterred. He could be set off quite easily and would just flip. If you ever tried to break away from the constant theme of tactics and fighting the guerrillas and how to win the war, he would jump right back on the same track. "No, no, no," he said crazily, almost jumping into the air. "They are directing the guerrilla war from here. This is their base of operations. They direct their operations and raise money and weapons in Panama, and this is where they have their contact with the Cubans." What he said was not true. Panama was not providing support to the FMLN. He was saying that allowing them to come to Panama was tantamount to our supporting the war effort. Yes, the Salvadoran guerrillas came to Panama, but so did the leaders of many other guerrilla movements. So did their opponents, like D'Aubuisson himself. The leaders of these movements were very careful. They knew, and we told them explicitly, that this was open territory, and that the world's intelligence services were all here, wandering around. But the rule was that nothing was to happen in Panama, that each of them was responsible for their own security, and we wanted no funny business. That this same warning would serve for every other country as well. "Look, what are you telling me here?" I said. "Everybody is free to come and go in Panama, but nobody is launching any operations. We don't permit it." "Está jodido, pues, that's fucked up," he said. "Toss them out or give them to me. Hand them over to me and nobody will ever know what happened." The subject illuminated the personality of the man. His prosecution of the war was like a psychosis, and his attitude also foreshadowed what he was really doing. The United Nations, capping off years of human rights reports, said D'Aubuisson controlled paramilitary death squads until the day he died and was responsible for thousands of deaths of non-combatants throughout the 1980s. While D'Aubuisson never said so directly, he talked about hitting the Marxists from all directions, saying, "The communists are like vermin. They must be exterminated." And if necessary, he would do so in a scorched earth campaign. These were the very words he used, and when he spoke, his eyes glistened with the ardor of what he was saying. "Just let anyone try to stop us," he said. "They'll see what happens." He went as far as to talk about his military branch separate from the political section of the ARENA, National Republican Alliance Party, which he had founded. "We have supporters getting anti-guerrilla defense training," he would tell me. When he talked about tactics, it was about his pride in his organization's and intelligence capacity in maintaining better files on people than any of the Salvadoran military had. He said that his intelligence was based on his connections with the United States. He never said with what part of the U.S. government. He simply said the USA, and referred at times to exchanging information and keeping tabs with U.S. officials. He felt himself empowered by U.S. policy, as did the Central American presidents, with whom, excluding, of course, Nicaragua, he had a more far-reaching relationship than has ever been told to do what he wanted with a perfect sense of mission. That was what he said whenever I met him. I once asked him if he feared international sanctions. No, he said, because he had his flanks covered by the knowledge that the State Department and the Central Intelligence Agency knew exactly what he was doing. He saw himself to be operating with the blessing of the United States, and he said he had the green light to wipe out Marxist-Leninists, as he always put it. One time, I remember trying to tease him into something. "You're like pure black coffee," I said, "like a cup of black espresso. Too strong, much too strong. You need a little bit of cream to balance things off. You're too extreme about this. Why don't you try talking with the other extreme? Why don't you talk to the Cubans, with Fidel's people?" "Sure, I can talk with them and debate with them, no problem," D'Abuisson said. "I'm not afraid to talk to them. I'm not afraid to talk to Fidel." I remember very well the day I introduced him to several members of the Cuban embassy in Panama. I had convinced D'Abuisson to meet with the Cubans to discuss Central America. The Cubans told the Salvadoran death squad leader that both sides could try to defuse the situation in El Salvador to end the bloodshed. While they supported the FMLN, the Cubans told D'Abuisson they saw them as an independent, autonomous force with their own principles and ideals. They also spoke to D'Abuisson about self-determination for El Salvador. I doubt that D'Abuisson ever understood what they were talking about. It never reached the level of negotiations, but with such an extremist, even a talk like this seemed to be worth something. The Cubans ended up inviting him to Havana, and he said that he would be willing to go. But as far as I know, it never came to anything. This was at the peak of the political violence, the disappearances and death squad activity in El Salvador. D'Abuisson came more and more often, and it was no shopping trip to the duty-free zone, where so many tourists go in Panama City to buy perfume and wristwatches. He was coordinating his operations with the Southern Command. Eventually, we caught them in the act. D'Abuisson and the Central Command, in violation of the Panama Canal treaties, began covert training of Salvadorans on Panamanian territory. Early in 1985, the Salvadoran operations were heating up. Planes loaded with supplies were shuttling back and forth from the United States to the U.S. bases and then on to El Salvador. One day, about 24 men arrived at Howard Air Base, Salvadorans without visas, traveling as military, saying they were going to a training course. The only problem was that the School of the Americas, the U.S. training center for police and military from Latin America, had been withdrawn from Panama, and the United States was not authorized to conduct military training for foreigners in Panama anymore. So, what were they doing? Our officer on duty at Panama Immigration let them come through, but reported it up the line. We presented a diplomatically worded complaint to the Salvadoran military. Why were they sending personnel to Panama without getting visas? It was a question of reciprocity at the very least. Panamanians needed visas to go to El Salvador. The opposite was also true. The complaint was filed and nothing happened. Then another group arrived, and they were denied entry. This time, the generals at the U.S. Southern Command got involved, requesting entry for the Salvadorans, saying they were coming for a training course and asking for a visa. Retroactively, the Salvadorans also applied for visas at the Panamanian embassy in San Salvador, saying that they were on a group tour and that they were going to the Canal Zone. Our intelligence branch had no trouble in finding out that these Salvadorans were traveling with fake documents. If you have a passport that says your name is Captain Garcia, it isn't too hard to find out in San Salvador that there is no Captain Garcia in the armed forces, no matter how hard you try to pretend. We were able to find out about it through our secret channels. Our operatives in the American zone told us this was actually a top-secret training session, combining instruction in intelligence, explosives, counterinsurgency, demolition training, sharpshooting, etc. The training courses were so specific that they lasted only 3 weeks at a shot. This was not general instruction. People came for their intended purpose, catered to each individual. Snipers took sharpshooting training, explosive specialists took demolition training, intelligence operatives took intelligence training, then they went on their way, back to El Salvador for a little freedom fighting. The United States trained the death squads at the U.S. Southern Command.